read the topics and I said, man, you know what? The power of his wrath, or the power of God's wrath, that sounds interesting. That sounds like a more difficult topic. You know what? I'm going to choose that one, and hopefully these other speakers have an easier topic that they don't really have to study as deep for. And then I looked at the speaker lineup, and my preacher, Chris Presnell, is going to be here later. His brother, Brandon Presnell. Glenn Colley's going to be here. Tom Larkin's going to be here. So now I'm regretting that. All of them could have definitely covered this topic, but I am very excited about it, and we're going to dive into it. When I was young, I told this story a while back at Flint. My mom was actually there while I was preaching it, and she got on to me because I said that I was around 4 or 5 years old in the story, and she said, Hunter, that was completely inaccurate. You're closer to like 8. So if you can't tell from my name, you understand what my dad likes to do for a hobby, and that's deer hunting. He loves it. That's all we do. That's all we talk about. If I call him throughout the week, that's the only thing that we talk about is deer hunting and our trail cameras and what deer are looking good and what deer aren't and what's growing, what's not. And it's fun. When I was little, at 8 years old, we were in this hunting club. And he was in the camper and I was outside playing. And he told me one simple instruction. He said, hey, whatever you do, don't get on the trailer. I was like, okay, yeah, sure, whatever. He left, and as an 8-year-old, you can assume the first thing I did was as soon as he went back in the camper, I hopped on the trailer. What I did not know at the time was it was not hooked up to the truck. It was just sitting on the trailer hitch. So as I was in the front of the trailer, it was perfectly fine. And as you get into physics and you get into the back of the trailer, that trailer started to go up, and it scratched the entire back side of his tailgate on, I believe it was a newer blue truck that he had at that time. And he heard it, he walked outside, and he was mad, just like any parent would be. And I got a spanking for it. I remember that. And I learned, hey, if Dad says something, you probably need to follow it, or else there's going to be a punishment behind it. Oftentimes, that's what we see, even throughout the Bible, is this idea of the power of his wrath. And what we think, too, is this idea of judges. We think of judges. You think of John Marshall, who has a deep history within the United States. You think of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or maybe you're a TV fan of judges, and you think of Judge Judy, or all these different people. John Marshall, that I mentioned earlier, lived from 1755 to 1835, was a pivotal figure in the American history, serving as the 4th Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court from 1801 until his death. He's renowned for shaping the American legal system, particularly by establishing the principle of judicial review, which allows the Supreme Court to declare law unconstitutional. He's a very pivotal person when it comes to judges, but when we think of judges, we see a handful of things. A judge upholds the law, and their judgment is a necessary consequence for breaking it. My dad in that situation was the judge that day. He is upholding the law. He made a law for me, or he told me what to do, and that was to not get on the trailer. Just stay away from the trailer. Go anywhere else around here, but stay off of that one spot. And of course, that didn't happen. And he was upholding the law. There's consequences for breaking the law. There's consequences that we see for breaking the law in general. When it comes to our own lives, a courtroom scene where a judge hands down a sentence for a crime. And you can think of a time that you've seen it on TV, or a time that maybe you've had jury duty. If you've had jury duty, if you have not had jury duty, you really need to. It's awful. But it's your civil right to have jury duty. Somehow I've had it twice. And both times I've been dismissed, but I've still had to go up there, and I've had it twice. And it's not as fun as everybody makes it out to be. It's not as enjoyable. But that's what we see here, is this courtroom scene where you have the judges for both sides, or the judge, you have the lawyers on both sides, and you have the jury, and everything's being presented to them. So you have this courtroom scene. The judge hands down a sentence. It's jail time, or you do get that ticket, or it's some sort of punishment for the things that you're doing. So what we see in our world is a lot of this happens still. The Bible speaks of God as the ultimate judge, and his wrath is often described as a form of divine justice. What I want us to understand is God is not an angry God. God is not a mean God. God is a just God. We have to understand that. We cannot have only perfection in the world. If there is good in the world, there has to be some sort of opposite, which is, of course, is bad. in the very beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth. He creates man, and he allows us to have this free will. And this is not a conversation for free will. We can do that in another class. You have Zach go into great detail about what free will is. But he offers us free will because there has to be a counterpart to goodness. There has to be a counterpart to this perfect world that God has created, an opportunity for us to choose against God. And through that, he becomes a just God. He's not, as I mentioned, he's not an angry God. He's not a God seeking vengeance. He's not a God waiting for you to mess up so he can punish you. He's a God who wants you to follow him daily and keep his word and do what he tells you. And it's as simple as that. And what we're going to get into are a handful of different stories throughout the Bible that show people going against God. And what we see is a lot of punishment happening. And then we'll end it with a good side as well. But that's kind of what we're looking at tonight, is this idea. God's wrath is a profound and sobering effect of his holy nature. That's who he is. Yet his wrath is not the end of the story. It's balanced by his mercy, love, offering hope to those who turn to him. And we need to really pay attention to that part. It reflects his righteous anger against sin and rebellion, revealing his justice and commitment to his righteousness. He tells us how to live. He tells us what to do. And if we go against that, we're punished for it. You see very early, and we're not going to get into this one tonight in the story, you see very early in Adam and Eve, they're told not to eat of the fruit. I heard someone say the other day, I wonder how long they looked at that fruit before they ate it. I wonder how many times they passed that tree. I wonder how many times did they notice. And for me, my question is, I wonder what it looked like. Did it look like of course, we play it out to be an apple. So for this situation, let's say it does look like an apple, but does it look like an apple? Or is it red? Is it the same shape? Or maybe is it sparkly? Is it getting their attention? Or is it just something that God says, hey, stay away from that fruit. Do not eat of that fruit of that tree. You can have everything else. It's the same situation. Listen, Hunter, you can play anywhere else on this campground, but do not get on that trailer. You can eat of every single fruit here in the garden. You can have whatever you want, but stay away from this one. I just wonder what it looked like. But yet we see his wrath happening, then the fall of man after that happens. We want justice in a courtroom, but we don't want God to be just towards us. Isn't that right? We want justice to be served. We want the law to be upheld. But when it comes to us and our spiritual walk with God, oftentimes we shy away from God being a just God. We want him to not look at us in that way, to only see the good sides of us. So tonight we're going to be looking at a couple of different things. Oh, it's not clicking now. I don't know if I messed it up. I'm telling you guys, I've had terrible, terrible luck this summer. And while we're figuring this out, you can just click to the next. If you just want to click to the next one and then just have it all pop up, that's fine too. We've done that before as well. But I've had terrible luck. I'm 2 for 8 at this point this summer on things working the right way with my PowerPoints. But we see God's wrath is righteous and just. And really what we mean by that is we're going to be looking at a handful of things. God's wrath is not arbitrary or emotional. It flows from his perfect holiness. It flows from him, and it flows from his perfect creation. If you will turn me to Genesis chapter 1. And of course, we know the story. We know we can recite it from memory. Genesis 1 is creation. God's creating the heavens and the earth. He's created everything. But I want us to look at a couple of things here. We see Genesis chapter 1. We see the things that are being created. And we see how it's kind of working. Then God said, verse 9, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into the place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and gathered together the waters he called seas. And God saw it was good. And what we see throughout this, really through chapter 1 of creation, we see a handful of repetition happening. First of all, we see, then God said. God speaks, it happens. But at the end of a lot of these, that's what we're noticing is, and God saw that it was good. And it keeps going. God saw it was good. God saw it was good. But then we get to Verse 26, then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the seas, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle of all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created him in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. Then God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on this earth. And God said, see, I have given you every herb that yields seeds, which is on the face of the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seeds. To you it shall be your food. Also to every beast of the field, to every bird of the air, to everything that creeps on the earth, in which there is life, I have given every green herb food for food. And it was so. I want us to pay attention to verse 31. It's the completion of creation. Verse 31, then God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. How great is that? He just created he created everything. And in my mind, as I'm reading this and I'm seeing this, I'm imagining God kind of taking that step back, looking over everything that's been created, looking over everything that he's just done, and he looks at it and he simply says, it was very good. He was pleased with the things that he did. At this moment, this was a perfect world. What we know is there comes free will, and what we know from that, there comes the fall of man shortly after that. But what I want us to really focus on for this one is a little bit more into that. Sin violates his divine order, and his wrath upholds justice. When you go against God, when you fall to sin, his wrath is upheld. Is this just God? We just looked at Genesis 1:31, but now I want us to turn to Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6, and we're going to be looking at verses 5 through 8, but what I want us to really focus on right here is verse 6. Verse 6, we'll start in verse 5. Then the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent and thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and that he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping things, and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. So we go from Genesis chapter 1, verse 31 of ending creation on day 6, and he's made everything, and God takes this step back, and he looks, and he sees, and it was very good. To the point that we get to Genesis chapter 6 and verse 6. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth. That's a big swing, isn't it? This God who's just made this perfect creation. Now, a lot has happened in between. Of course, we have the fall of man. We have a handful of things happening in between. What we see here is the wickedness and judgment of man. He's a just God. He's an honest God. He's a truthful God. And we see that he's sorrowful. He's sorry that he made man. And what we see after that. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both men and beasts, creeping things, birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of God. Now, why did that happen? That's the question. Why did that happen? Why does that happen? What does that look like? What does that mean for the people in this story? Well, what we see is what's happening before. What we just read, verse 5. Then the Lord saw what the wickedness of man was, or that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. God's wrath is not arbitrary or emotional. It flows from his perfect holiness. We had a perfect holiness. We had a perfect world living in Genesis chapter 1, verse 31. And from there, it becomes so corrupt because you see, sin violates his divine order. Sin violates the things that he's telling us to do, the way he's telling us to live, the things that he's telling us to be. And his wrath upholds justice. that he looked into the world and he saw only evil things happening. That was the only thing that's happening around him. That's their only thoughts that they could have, that they were continually thinking and doing evil things. So he decides to flood the earth. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Verse 9, this is the genealogy of Noah. And we see, as we continue, verse 13, into 13 and into 7, the creation of the ark, the things that he was doing. And what we see here, even more than just this slide, is Noah beginning to build this ark. God going to Noah and telling him he's going to flood the world. He's going to end all of mankind, all the beasts, all the birds of the air, all the creeping things of the world. And he's going to start over. And he gives Noah specific instructions, doesn't he? Just like he gave instructions on how to live and what to eat and what not to eat in earlier times in Genesis 1, he gives Noah these specific instructions. And he tells them how to build the ark, what to build it out of, what size to build it, what animals to bring onto the ark. He gives them everything. I want us to imagine, what if Noah didn't follow that? What if Noah also went against God? And we'll say sinned in this situation. Sin violates his divine order. What would that story have looked like? But instead, he followed what God had to say, and he was saved. He was spared while everybody else had passed on during this flood. So we see God's wrath is righteous and just. He's not pointing people out. He's not singling someone out. It's righteous and it's just. He is a holy God. Number 2, God's wrath warns us of consequences. There are consequences that happen. And what we see here is Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis chapter 19, verse 24 and 25. And we'll turn to that here in a second. I believe it was my senior year of high school, we took an economics class. I think it was microeconomics. And one of my good friends, and we were both roommates at Freed, we were both in the same group. And this project we had to do is you had to come up with your own city. And your city had to have like a main business, a secondary business, and then like a reason for these businesses to be, functioning would be the right way to say that. So we thought about it, and we spent way too much time thinking about how we wanted this project to go instead of working on the project. But we came up with this idea of our town was Sodom and Gomorrah. And every single day, fire would rain down and burn up the houses. So your main business was the construction company, and his family owns an insurance company. So your secondary business is the insurance company as well. And every time I think of this, I think back of that time, and what a great way it was to explain to the people of the class that had no idea of what Sodom and Gomorrah was, of what that story was, what it looked like. But we didn't do it justice because there's so much more that happens within this. Turn to Genesis chapter 19. Genesis 19, and we see starting in verse 12 the entire story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And what we're looking at is 24 and 25. Then the Lord rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of these heavens. So he overthrew those cities, all the plain, all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. But his wife, and we see Lot, but his wife looked behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. And how does the story start? Well, we know about Sodom and Gomorrah. We know that it was only evil, and we know a handful of things happened in this. Despite Abraham's intercessions in Genesis 18, the city's unrepented sin led to their downfall. Because what do we know about Abraham? He tried his best, didn't he? He tried to save that city. He kept going out. He said, if there are so many righteous people in this city, just please let it be spared. And what did God allow? He allowed it to be spared. He said, if you find this many people, then I will spare this city. And he goes back to him. He says, all right, well, I didn't find that many people. And the number keeps going down even more. God knows how many righteous people are in this city. And he knows that it's not worth saving because he knows these people have gone so far away from him. Abraham tried. The city's unrepented sin led to their downfall. And that's what we notice within this. Is illustrates how God's wrath serves as a warning. The cities were consumed by fire and brimstone due to their immorality and disregard for God's ways. God's wrath warns us of consequences. That if we go against what he teaches, if we go against the things that he says, if we go against the Bible itself, there are going to be consequences to the things around us. Yet God spared Lot and his wife, showing that his wrath is tempered by mercy for those who heed his call, for those who follow him, for those who listen to him, for those that obey his word. But we see there still is consequences, are there? Because she had one job. She was told one thing: don't turn back. Or the entire family, don't turn back and look at the city. Keep going. And what do we see? She turned back, but his wife looked behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. I don't know if y'all have seen it or not. I've seen it on Facebook and Instagram, but it's all the new AI videos of the Bible. Have y'all seen those? I'm going to be honest, they're hilarious. A lot of them not accurate, but they're hilarious. And one of them was Lot's wife vlogging. She was filming herself leaving Sodom and Gomorrah. And she was talking to her followers or whoever she was talking to on her phone. It was, should I look back? Should I look back? And she finally does. She keeps faking it. Then she finally does look back, and then boom, she's a pillar of salt. And I laughed at it. And I was like, man, that's really funny, because we try and build these images of stories in the Bible. We try and build up these colorful pictures in our mind of maybe what that might have looked like. And that gave me a really good picture of what it looked like. Now, were there phones? Absolutely not. Is that how it exactly went? Absolutely not. But I think that's the seriousness of God. That's the seriousness of his word. That's the seriousness of breaking his word, because we have to understand that God and has his wrath, but God's a serious God as well. He means what he says. He is a just God, and we just talked about it. We think of Noah and the ark. Y'all just had VBS. This looks fantastic. One of my earliest VBS memories of my home congregation was actually the story of Noah and the ark. We walked into this room, and there were flickering lights, and they had spray bottles, and they were spraying, and we sat down, and there were all these stuffed animals around us. I remember that. And I remember hearing that story in VBS, and how great is that story? And you hear of Sodom and Gomorrah, and oh man, that's terrible. That entire city got wiped away. But what we're not understanding is everyone dies in this situation. Everyone dies in this story. Those who are not faithful to God were punished. What's the movie? Evan Almighty? Evan Almighty or Bruce Almighty, where it's kind of reenacting the ark, and it's a really silly movie. But there's a real part about that really stuck out to me the most, and it's when he's finished the ark, and everybody's around him, the media, all of his friends, everybody's calling him crazy, and then it starts to rain. And those people run up on the ark, and then they start making fun of them while they're on the ark, and it was just this little shower, there's no way it's going to flood. And that hit me. That's what stuck out to me the most, because the people of Noah's time did not have that opportunity, did they? We think about Noah and the ark. We think about Sodom and Gomorrah. And we think about how their VBS stories, and we think of the pillar of salt, and how tall was the pillar of salt? Was it her height? And we think of these things of the silly kid things. But oftentimes we forget about the seriousness of God. God closed that door on the ark. And you can't help but sit back and wonder how many people were trying to swim to that ark to stay alive. How many people were clawing at the sides of that boat. How many people were screaming out for Noah and his family to save them. What about Sodom and Gomorrah? How many people were running around as the brimstone and fire starts to fly out of the sky and destroy their town? How many of them started to panic at that moment? How many of them tried to leave their town to be safe? How many of them, in both stories, how many of them realize that they'd been going against God the entire time? There is a seriousness of God. There is God's wrath, because he is this just God. And that's what we see here. God's wrath warns us of consequences. This reminds us that God's warnings are meant to lead us to repentance. That's the seriousness of God. that we talk about heaven and hell, and that there are two different places that you could possibly go once you die. And this is for eternity. And I struggle with that. I struggle with the word eternity. Even I've had classes on, I've had professors explain it, but I can't comprehend that, because it's eternity. Like, yeah, it's a long time. I know, yeah, it's going to be a lengthy period. No. It's forever. It's the rest of your life. The best way I had it explained, I saw it on video, but I also had another youth minister do this trick, and he had a bunch of rope, and it was as if I had rope in my hand, and like the rope went out a back door, went into one of these classrooms. There was just a bunch of it in there, and there's this little tiny black part on this rope, and he said, this is your life. This is from the time that you're born until the time that you die. This is your life. And he said, and the rest of this is eternity. And he kept, of course, he had a ton of rope, so he knew how much he could pull. But like, he kept pulling the rope and kept pulling the rope and kept pulling the rope, and it kept coming out. And that kind of puts into perspective. We have the opportunity, we have the possibility to spend eternity in heaven with God, forever with God. But if we don't follow his word, if we don't follow his teachings, if we don't follow the things that he's telling us to do, if we're not being Christ-like in our actions, our manners, we also have an eternity, but it's not in heaven with God, because he's a just God. God's wrath warns us of consequences. God's wrath confronts hypocrisy. Turn to Acts chapter 5. Acts chapter 5. We're looking at verses 1 through 11. And we won't really dive in completely into that one to begin with. But what we see here is Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5. As I just close my Bible. Acts chapter 5, Ananias and Sapphira. But a certain man named Ananias with Sapphira, his wife, sold a possession, and he kept back part of the proceeds, his wife also being aware of it, and brought a certain part and laid it at the apostles' feet. But Peter said, Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and keep back part of the price of the land for yourself? While it remained, was it not your own? And after it was sold, was it not in your own control? Why have you conceived this thing in your heart? You have not lied to men, but to God. Then Ananias, hearing these words, fell down and breathed his last breath. So great fear came upon all those who heard these things. And the young men arose and wrapped him and carried him out and buried him. And you can continue reading, but we'll stop there for time's sake. We have Ananias and Sapphira reveals God's wrath against deceit in his church, deceit in our hearts. What we said is this hypocrisy. We saw Ananias sells this land, and he's going to give this money to the apostles for teaching and for anything that was needed at that time, but yet he kept some back after saying he'd give everything. And they noticed that, and they saw it, and yet he falls down and he dies. That's what we see within it. They sold property and lied about giving the full amount to the apostles, pretending to be fully devoted. Pretending to be fully devoted towards God. They tried to make it look like they were, but on the other hand, they were living a different life. They were keeping that money. They were not allowing that money to go towards God himself. And if that doesn't also happen to us sometimes, this warns us to approach God with honesty and reverence as his Spirit discerns our hearts. I want us to really pay attention to that and think about this. This idea of God's wrath confronts hypocrisy, and how sometimes maybe we fall to this hypocrisy. Sometimes we fall to this idea of saying that we're a Christian, but on the other hand, hiding our real life, hiding who we actually are, hiding the way that we act or behave. Because let's face it, when you get here, it's easy to be a Christian, isn't it? You're surrounded by other Christians. Hopefully there's no sin that's coming in that's really tempting you at this moment, because you're surrounded by God's people. It's easy to be a Christian. But then you get to Monday morning at work. You get to Monday morning at school. You get to Monday morning at whatever it is, and people dislike Mondays because that's the first day of the week, and you have to get up and you have to go to school. And sometimes we're not in the best mood, are we? And you allow that mood to carry on and maybe affect other people. Because you're a Christian Sunday and you're sitting down in your pew and you're listening to Zach's sermon and you partook the Lord's Supper and you sang the songs and you did everything you're supposed to do. But when it comes to the real world, you act a different way, you talk a different way, you behave a different way. You just aren't that person, are you? I want you to understand that when we show up to church and we're going to say we go through the motions and then we act a different way outside of church, that does not make us a Christian. We talk about lukewarmness all the time. You see it in Revelation of this lukewarm Christianity. I want you to understand that changes from you not being a Christian to Christianity as your hobby. Think about that. You don't spend any time with God. You show up and go through the motions. You want to check off this box. You say you're a Christian, but your actions aren't backing up your claims. Well, it just turns into a hobby, doesn't it? The thing that you do every now and then, the thing that you do on the weekends, the thing that you do when it's convenient for you. What happened? Ananias sells property and lied about giving the full amount to the apostles, pretending to be fully devoted. How many of us oftentimes are pretending to be fully devoted in our faith? How many of us oftentimes are pretending to be fully devoted when it comes to our Christianity only when it's convenient for us, only when it's going to help us out, or maybe only when we're surrounded by other Christians? I use an analogy a lot within the youth group, and I want you to act like it's a play, and you're at a theater, and you're on stage. And my most recent play, I have a handful of kids in youth group. They're very talented, but they're into plays, and I'm not used to that. Like, I was Oompa Loompa #1 in middle school for a play, but like it was just because I could not talk to everybody around me if I was up front. And like she tricked me on that. But like I've started going to these plays and they're really cool and they're good. It's just this whole, like everything is just perfect about it. I went and watched Hairspray, the musical, and it was awesome. I didn't think I would like it whatsoever. I was like, man, this is about to be so lame. This is about like 2.5 hours of my life. It was fantastic. They did a great job. But if you think about that player, you think about your favorite player, just one that you remember. Imagine you being on stage and you're the main actor or actress, and you have to play every single role. You have every single, we're going to call them masks. You have every single mask that you need. And you're trying to play these roles, and you're trying to be one person, then you have to be the next person, you have to be the next person. How exhausting would that be at the end of that play? If you pulled it off correctly, it would be exhausting, wouldn't it? But sometimes we treat Christianity that way as well, don't we? We have all these masks. We have the mask that we wear to church on Sundays and Wednesdays because we need to look like a Christian. We have the mask that we wear to work because, we act a little bit different at work. We have the mask that we wear when we get back home because we might not say some things in front of our spouse or our kids. And oftentimes it's filled with hypocrisy. Instead of being the same person we are every single day. Instead of being the same person we are when we show up to church. When we have reverence for God. I want us to understand something too. When we see this, this warns us to approach God with honesty and reverence as His Spirit discerns our hearts. I want us to understand this reverence idea. It's holding God at a higher place. It's holding God as the person in your life. And I want us to think about that in terms of the Old Testament. And when you look in the Old Testament, you look in the original language and dive into it a little bit, what you'll notice is they never referred to God as God. They referred to Him mostly as Yahweh or Adonai. And both of those are not referencing God Himself. And the reason they did that was because they did not want to lose that reverence for God. They did not want to say something wrong or do something in the wrong way to take away from who God actually was. They had reverence for Him. They used Yahweh as another way of expressing who God was so they would not dishonor Him, the things that they're doing. Now, that is very serious in our world, and we don't say Yahweh, we refer to Him as God. But I want us to understand the reverence of it. of understanding that God is the God who created all things, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, and that's who we're here to worship. That's who we're here to follow. Not to be hypocrites or fall to hypocrisy when it comes to God. Not to say that we're Christians, but instead be fully devoted to Him. And that's what we see with God's wrath confronts hypocrisy. And then God's wrath defends His holiness. And this is one of my favorite. I love this. Turn to John chapter 2, verse 13 through 17. Jesus cleansed the temple. John chapter 2. John chapter 2, and we're looking at verses 13 through 17. My page will flip. And if you have your titles, mine says Jesus cleanses the temple. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to the Jerusalem, and he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and dove, and the money changers doing business. When he had made a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overturned the tables. And he said to those who sold doves, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise." Then his disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house has eaten me up." So the Jews answered and said to him, "What sign do you show to us, since you do these things?" Jesus answered and said to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." And we'll stop there for time being. But what we see here is Jesus cleansing the temple. And just background to this, it's the Passover. The Jews are there. Jesus is going to the temple for the Passover. And this is what he notices. This is the things that he's noticed is happening within his church. He's upset with it. Of course, his righteous anger was a display of divine wrath. And I want us to understand that. His righteous anger was a display of divine wrath. Now we're going to be silly for just a moment. That does not mean that you have the right to get angry at any moment of your life and say, because Jesus turned the tables, I can get angry as well. Because most of the time, I'm going to say most of the time, 99% of the time when we get angry, it's not because of divine wrath. It's because we were inconvenienced or something happened in our lives that we get upset about. So when someone cuts you off tomorrow on the way to work, going into Huntsville, because I'm sure that happens all the time, you can't blame Jesus for turning over tables as the reason that you get angry with other people. Back to it. His righteous anger was a display of divine wrath. They were disrespecting his Father's house. They were selling things. This challenges us to examine whether our lives honor God's holiness or profane it. Are we honoring God's holiness? Are we building up God's holiness? Or are we tearing it down? I had the great opportunity growing up in Atlanta, one, to watch the Falcons and never be successful, but two, to be able to go to a couple games in the Georgia Dome. And it was so cool. And then they built Mercedes-Benz Stadium, and I got to sit back. And it was while I was in college, so I watched it from a distance, but I got to watch it get built. And it took years. It took forever, a lot longer than I expected it to take. But then I also had the opportunity to watch the Georgia Dome get taken down. It was exploded. It was the coolest thing. And I got to watch that on TV. And that was neat too. And I think about it. And I look at the comparison of it. And it took forever for that new stadium to be built. And you know how long it took for the old stadium to be destroyed? It was like 12 seconds. From the time that they set off the bombs, the explosions, and for that stadium to completely crumble was 12 seconds. So much so that there was a news reporter who camped out for, I think it was like 2 days ahead of time, to have this perfect shot of this Georgia Dome to collapse on this bridge. And it was the perfect situation. So much so that when he started recorded, as soon as they exploded, a MARTA bus came in front of that camera for all 12 seconds. And when that MARTA bus left, that stadium was no longer standing. And that's super inconvenient for that guy. I feel so bad for him. But think about that. It took some 3 years to build that new stadium, and it took seconds to destroy that old stadium. This challenges us to examine whether we live, or whether our lives honor God's holiness, whether our lives are building God's holiness up or tearing his holiness down, whether we're taking our Christianity serious or whether we're showing other people that it's no big deal. It takes a while for us to show people and honor God and his holiness and grow those things. Is that 5 minutes left with that? Fair enough. Zach explained it all to me, and I've forgotten by now. Yes. So, and what you see from that is it takes a lot longer to build things up than it does to destroy them. It takes a lot longer for you to build a relationship with somebody else and tell them about God and build them up in the faith and show them who God is than it is for you to not be a Christian out in the world and for people to completely just cut you off from any Christian talk that you might want to say to them. There's a lot to that. And I mentioned this is not giving you an excuse to get angry. But that's what we're seeing here. God's wrath defends his holiness. And then the last one is God's wrath leads to hope. And we'll get into a little bit more of this later, but we see in Romans chapter 5, verse 9, since we have now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? We see he is a just God, he is a righteous God, and he's an honest God. And if we follow him and we do the things that he's telling us to do and live the way that we're supposed to, we are rewarded for it. Jesus took the wrath we deserved on the cross, offering us reconciliation with God. He died on the cross for our sins. He took that wrath away from us so we may be reconciled with God. For those who hear, believe, repent, confess, and are baptized, there is hope, forgiveness, and eternal life. He is a just God, but he's an honest God as well. And he is a God that loves us more than we can ever understand. So much so that we see that he sent his only son to die on the cross for our sins so we may be saved. We need to make sure that we're living our lives in a way that leads to God and leads others to God. And make sure we're not living that life that's pushing others away from him or that life of hypocrisy of where we claim to be Christians, but we're living a life totally in sin or living this double life, what we mentioned of the masks, of living this life here and then living a life outside the church, making sure that we live a Christian life everywhere we go. So I'll come back here in a moment. Do I offer invitation now or we wait? That's fine. Like I said, Zach called me and he explained it, and it's not that I didn't pay attention during the conversation, but I really just didn't pay attention as much as I needed to. But he did explain it. So we just pause and then come back? Cool. Short pause. We'll be back. I really should have paid attention. Sorry, Emily. Don't tell him that. Oh, perfect. I really should have paid attention. That would have been great. But that's what we're seeing here. God's wrath leads to hope. We had the negatives. When we go against God, bad things happen to us. When we go against God, we're punished. God is the ultimate judge, is what we mentioned in the very beginning. He's the ultimate judge. And when we go against him, there is punishment. But when we go with him, it leads to hope. And what we see here is just this conclusion. The power of God's wrath reminds us of his holiness and the seriousness of sin, but it also directs us to his grace. When we follow him and we follow his word, we begin to see things, what we're going to say is in a different way than the rest of the world. We begin to see this holiness. We begin to see this seriousness of sin. We begin to see that we do not need to live a life of sin, but we also see that it's directing us towards his grace. and the way that he wants us to live. The flood spared Noah. Lot was delivered. And Christ's sacrifice opens the door for redemption. We see all of these things happening, knowing that there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. We saw that in Romans 8:1. That's what we start to notice. Knowing that there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Let us turn from sin, embrace his mercy, and live in the hope of his love. Making sure that we don't fall into these same categories, but we understand that God's wrath is righteous and just. We understand that God's wrath warns us of consequences, that if we don't follow him, there are consequences to that. Making sure that God's wrath confronts hypocrisy, that it pushes us away from it, that it pushes us to a life of loving him, and that God's wrath defends his holiness, that we're living a life that brings others closer to God, and not a life that's pushing people farther away. And understand that God's wrath also leads to hope. It leads to our hope, that we're living a life in Christ. We're living a life according to Christ, and that one day we may have hope for eternity in heaven one day. So that's the question for tonight for you is what does that hope for you look like? Have you been living a life for God, or have you been living a life for the world? Have you been living a life for God, or have you been living a life for yourself? What does that look like for you? Maybe you need prayers of congregation, and you've just been struggling to have that separation. You've been struggling to be that Christian every single day, and you just want prayers, and you just want encouragement, and you just want people to surround you at this time. You have that opportunity. Or maybe you haven't been baptized, and you want to be baptized into Christ, into God's family, and be able to have that hope of eternity. You have that opportunity tonight as well. Whatever your needs may be tonight, just please let it be known as we stand and sing.